Kindness without wisdom creates suffering. You're the one everyone counts on, the one who listens, the one who shows up, the one who quietly holds everything together, even when you're falling apart inside. But lately, something shifted. You feel tired, not just in your body, but in your heart. There's no dramatic crisis, no big betrayal, just this lingering fatigue, a soft, quiet ache that whispers, I keep giving, and yet I feel more and more invisible. You lie awake some nights wondering, why do I feel so drained when all I did was try to be kind? And here's a truth that almost no one dares to say out loud. Kindness can hurt when it forgets wisdom, when compassion turns into obligation, when giving becomes surviving, when you say yes on the outside while your whole being is silently screaming no. In Buddhism, compassion is sacred, but it is not blind. The Buddha never taught us to abandon ourselves in the name of love. True compassion, he said, arises from clarity, from seeing what uplifts and what quietly destroys. Because even a lotus, as beautiful as it is, must know when to rise above the mud that once nourished it. So this isn't a video about blaming others. This is about waking up to the ways we abandon ourselves for approval, for peace, for love that costs too much. It's about returning to the one thing that truly matters, your inner stillness, your mindful heart, your freedom. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore 5 kinds of relationships that often chip away at your peace, slowly, silently, and without intention. Not because these people are evil, but because suffering moves in cycles. And sometimes, the people we care about the most are the ones who pull us farthest from ourselves. This is your invitation to pause, to breathe, to remember that you don't need to prove your goodness by abandoning your boundaries. That saying no with clarity is not unkind, it's sacred, and that the deepest compassion begins not out there, but within. Let us walk this path together, not to shut our hearts, but to open them more wisely. Because kindness without wisdom becomes suffering, but kindness with awareness, that is freedom. To protect your peace is not selfish, it is spiritual, inspired by Buddhist wisdom. The hidden cost of being too kind. You didn't choose kindness as a strategy. It's just who you are. Maybe you learned it early, being the peacemaker in a loud home, the responsible one when others were falling apart. Somewhere along the way, kindness became your language. But no one told you that even a beautiful language, when overused, can begin to hurt the one who speaks it. You're always helping, always holding space, and you tell yourself it's no big deal. But slowly, your days fill with the needs of others. Your schedule bends to accommodate. Your emotions shift to soothe. And your inner world, once clear and grounded, begins to blur. You find yourself agreeing when you want to say no, apologizing when you've done nothing wrong, staying silent just to keep the peace. And one day, you wake up and realize you've built a life where everyone is cared for, except you. In Buddhist wisdom, compassion must be guided by clarity. Without discernment, kindness turns into self-erasure. It becomes a way to disappear, to avoid conflict, to earn love by sacrificing your own well-being. But this is not the compassion the Buddha taught. True compassion includes yourself. It knows when to offer a hand and when to step back. It knows that enabling suffering is not the same as relieving it. And it understands that kindness without boundaries is not kindness, it's compulsion. There's a reason the Buddha taught the middle path, not too much, not too little. Because anything, even goodness, when taken to the extreme, becomes its opposite. And when you give and give without pause, the cost is not just time or energy. The cost is your presence, your joy, your peace. Modern psychology agrees. Dr. Gabor Mate, a physician who has worked with trauma for decades, often says that many people develop people-pleasing as a survival strategy in childhood. But what once kept You safe can now keep you stuck, locked in a life where saying yes is automatic and saying no feels like guilt. It's not a flaw, it's a wound, and healing begins the moment you bring awareness to it. So take a breath, place your hand gently over your heart, and ask yourself, who am I still trying to save, and what is it costing me? Because being kind is beautiful, but being whole is sacred. And the first boundary you ever need to draw is not between you and others, but between your true self and the part of you that believes being exhausted is the same as being good. This isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming conscious. It's about choosing when and how you give, so that your kindness nourishes others without depleting you, so that your presence becomes a gift, not a sacrifice. In the end, being kind without wisdom is not sustainable. But when your kindness is rooted in self-respect, it becomes something much deeper, a form of love that includes you, too. The echo chamber, when you're no longer heard. You sit across from them, sharing something close to your heart, a memory, a worry, a small joy. But before you even finish your sentence, they interrupt. Their voice rises, their story takes over, and the moment that was once yours slips away. You nod politely, smile out of habit, and say nothing. But inside, something aches, not because they meant harm, but because you realize you weren't truly heard. This is the quiet pain of the echo chamber, being in the presence of someone who only listens to respond, not to understand. Conversations become one-sided. You become a mirror for their life, their needs, their experiences. And over time, your own voice begins to fade, not just in the room, but in your own sense of self. In Western culture, where speaking louder often wins the room, it's easy to mistake volume for value. But in Buddhism, true connection begins with deep listening. The Buddha once said that mindful speech includes not just what you say, but how you receive the words of others. When someone speaks and is not heard, it creates disconnection. But when you are the one never heard, it creates loneliness, even in a crowd. This loneliness isn't dramatic. It looks like smiling while shrinking, like listening while holding your own thoughts hostage, like being surrounded by noise but starved for presence. And when this happens often, especially in close relationships, you may begin to feel invisible, not because you've disappeared, but because your presence is only valued for what it reflects back, not for what it is. Dr. Brené Brown, a researcher on vulnerability and connection, often says, "Connection is the energy that exists between people when they feel seen, heard, and valued. Without that, we're not relating. We're performing. We're surviving." So how do we respond? Not with anger, but with awareness. Not by shutting down, but by gently reclaiming our space. The next time you're interrupted, try saying, "I'd really like to finish what I was sharing. It matters to me," not as a demand, but as a reminder that your voice has value too. And if the pattern continues, if you find yourself consistently being silenced in someone's presence, it's okay to step back. Not every relationship is meant to hold your story. Some people only have room for their own echoes. That doesn't make them bad, but it doesn't mean you have to stay lost inside their volume. The truth is, your story deserves air. Your thoughts deserve space. Your presence is not a reflection, it is a light. And the more you honor it, the more you attract those who will honor it, too. In Buddhist practice, we don't just speak with compassion, we listen with presence. Real connection, like real kindness, cannot exist without mutuality. If your voice is always quieted, if your experience is always overlooked, you're not in a relationship, you're in a performance. And that's not where peace grows. So today, return to your voice. Even if it trembles, even if it's soft. Speak, not to dominate, but to connect. And when you find someone who listens, not just with their ears, but with their heart, stay close. That's sacred. Words that cut. When concern becomes control. They say it's just concern. They say they care. But over time, their words leave you smaller, doubting, questioning your own choices. It begins subtly. You sure that's the right decision? I'm just worried about you. I know you mean well, but these comments arrive like tiny arrows wrapped in softness. You hesitate to react because the tone isn't harsh. It's wrapped in love or something that looks like it. But that's what makes it confusing. Because you walk away not angry, not even hurt in the obvious sense, just unsettled. Like your own judgment can't be trusted. Like who you are needs fixing. In Buddhism, words are not neutral. They carry karma. A word spoken with clarity and care can heal. A word dressed as care, but rooted in control, can harm just as deeply as open criticism. This is the suffering of the well-meaning critic, someone who uses the language of concern to manage your life, to insert doubt, to steer your path. And you, because you are kind and open-hearted, begin to internalize it. You begin to shrink, not because they shouted, but because they whispered in just the right way. Dr. Kristen Neff, a leading voice in self-compassion research, teaches that the harshest critic often lives within us, but it almost always begins with voices from the outside. Parents, partners, even friends who love us, but love us through fear, through control, through unspoken expectations. And what's worse, they may genuinely believe they're helping. But there's a quiet violence in words that disguise judgment as love. A kind of emotional erosion that leaves you second-guessing your intuition. And the more it continues, the more you begin to seek approval rather than inner truth. You begin to live a life edited by others. The Buddha taught that right speech is not just about what we say, but why we say it. Are our words motivated by fear, by a desire to control, or by a deep wish to uplift, without attachment to the outcome? So if you find yourself shrinking after a conversation that was just concern, pause, breathe, ask, was this love, or was this control wearing the mask of love? And if the answer is unclear, return to yourself, to your breath, to your own stillness. Because the truth is, people can be kind and still, controlling. They can love you and still not see you. And your role is not to convince them, but to remember yourself. Setting boundaries here isn't dramatic. It can be as soft as, I hear you, but I trust my own path, as steady as, I know you care, but this is my choice to make. You don't owe anyone access to your doubt. You owe yourself a safe place to grow. And if you've been the one who speaks in these ways, let this be your awakening. The most loving thing you can offer someone is belief, in their wholeness, not in your version of it. Because words that cut don't always shout. Sometimes they whisper. And sometimes healing begins with hearing your own voice again and realizing it was never broken. Not my burden. Releasing what was never yours. You want to help. Of course you do. It's in your nature. You see someone struggling, emotionally, financially, spiritually, and your heart moves. Maybe it's a sibling who can't seem to get their life together, a friend who always needs rescuing, a grown child who calls only when something goes wrong. At first, your help feels like love. It feels like compassion. But over time, you notice something. No matter how much you give, it's never enough. And worse, you're the one left drained, physically, emotionally, and sometimes even financially. This is the silent weight we carry when we take on burdens that were never ours to hold. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small moments, yes after yes, favor after favor, until suddenly, someone else's chaos lives inside your body. Their anxiety becomes your sleeplessness. Their irresponsibility becomes your exhaustion. And slowly, you begin to feel less like a person and more like a support system, a safety net, a constant emergency responder. In Buddhist teachings, we are reminded that every being must walk their own path. No one can cross the river of life for someone else. You can offer your hand, but you cannot swim for them. To carry what is not yours is not compassion, it's entanglement. And entanglement, no matter how noble it looks, only deepens suffering for both people. Modern psychology echoes this wisdom. Therapists speak of codependency, a pattern where your well-being becomes tethered to someone else's dysfunction, where helping becomes a form of control, where love turns into obligation, and where the line between caring and caretaking becomes so blurred you can no longer see yourself. But the truth is, you are not responsible for someone else's choices, not for their healing, not for their growth, not for the lessons life is trying to teach them. When you constantly rescue someone, you may be interrupting the very process their soul needs. Pain isn't always punishment. Sometimes it's the only language that awakens change. So how do you let go? Gently, not with guilt, but with grace. Not with rejection, but with clarity. It might sound like, I care deeply about you, but I'm no longer in a place to carry this. Or, this is your journey. I trust you'll find your own strength. And if the guilt creeps in, as it often does, remember this: you are not abandoning them. You are simply stepping out of the way so they can stand on their own. You are not cold. You are clear. You are not cruel. You are compassionate with boundaries. In the temple of your peace, not every burden is welcome, and some of the heaviest ones were never yours to begin with. The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering, not only to things, but to roles. The role of the fixer, the savior, the strong one. Sometimes, the most sacred thing you can do is lay down the armor of being needed and simply be. Let go, not because you don't care, but because you finally do. For them, and for yourself. When kindness feels empty, giving without gratitude. You give without asking. You offer your time, your energy, your heart, because that's who you are. You cook the meals, you listen to the late-night calls, you lend money, hold space, keep showing up, not because you want applause, but because it feels right. Because being kind feels like your nature. But over time, something begins to shift. You start to notice the silence after you give. No thank you, no warmth, just expectation. The meals are eaten, the help accepted, the favors taken, but the heart behind them goes unseen. You begin to feel like a vending machine. People press the button, and kindness comes out. No eye contact, no gratitude, just convenience. At first, you question yourself. Am I being too sensitive? Maybe they're just busy. Maybe I shouldn't expect anything. But deep down, a quiet ache begins to grow, not because you wanted praise, but because you're human, and all humans want to feel seen, valued, not for what we provide, but for who we are. In Buddhism, we are taught that true giving is without attachment. But that doesn't mean we give without awareness. It means we offer from a full cup, not one that's cracked and leaking. When kindness becomes a transaction with no return of care, it depletes the spirit. It turns generosity into resentment. It transforms service into silent suffering. The Buddha taught that intention matters. Giving from love brings peace. But giving out of guilt, fear, or obligation only deepens suffering for both giver and receiver. Because giving without boundaries isn't noble. It's unsustainable. And eventually, it becomes hollow. Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen once wrote, "Helping is based on inequality. Serving is based on wholeness. When you give from emptiness, you are helping. But when you give from fullness, you are serving." And that distinction is everything. So if your kindness starts to feel invisible, listen. Your heart may be trying to tell you it's time to pause, to step back, to refill your own cup, to stop pouring into hands that never say thank you. Not because you demand praise, but because you deserve mutuality. You deserve to feel like your presence is a gift, not a given. Maybe it's time to redirect your kindness toward people who meet you with presence, toward causes that fill your soul, toward a version of yourself that no longer believes self-worth is earned through self-sacrifice. The Buddha didn't ask us to give endlessly. He asked us to give wisely. And sometimes, the wisest thing you can do is stop giving where your kindness becomes invisible. Not out of bitterness, but out of love. Love for your peace. Love for your worth. Love for the kind, weary heart that has given so much and finally deserves something back. Boundaries are not walls, they are bridges. You were taught to be kind, to be giving, to be available, and somewhere along the way, you learned that saying no felt like a failure, that setting boundaries made you cold, distant, selfish, so you stretched yourself thin, accommodating everyone else's needs while quietly ignoring your own. But the truth is, the more you say yes to everything and everyone, the more you disappear, bit by bit, and it doesn't feel like selflessness, it feels like erasure. Boundaries are not rejection. They are not walls built out of bitterness or anger. In Buddhism, they are a form of mindfulness, a conscious way of honoring what is wholesome and releasing what brings harm. A boundary says, I value this relationship enough to keep it healthy. I value myself enough not to lose me in it. We often imagine boundaries as distance, but in truth, they are clarity. And clarity is what allows love to breathe. Without boundaries, love becomes obligation. Without space, connection becomes control. A bridge needs structure to hold weight. So does any healthy relationship. Dr. Nedra Glover Tawwab, a leading therapist and boundary expert, says, boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and still love myself. This is not cruelty. This is sustainability. It's the shift from emotional exhaustion to emotional honesty. Boundaries are the practice of choosing peace over performance, of recognizing that you're not responsible for managing everyone else's reactions, of understanding that you can be kind and still say no. That no is not a closing of the heart, but a way of keeping it intact. And yes, some people won't like it. Some will call you selfish, distant, ungrateful. But that says more about their expectations than your intentions. Let it be. Your job is not to make everyone comfortable. Your job is to live in integrity with your values, your energy, your truth. The Buddha taught that wise effort means knowing when to engage and when to step back. Boundaries are the living expression of that wisdom. They are how we stay rooted in compassion without being pulled into chaos. How we offer presence without self-abandonment. So begin where it feels smallest. Say no to what drains you. Say yes only when your whole being says yes. Speak gently, but firmly. Choose honesty over guilt. Let your yes be wholehearted and your no be clear. Because the relationships that truly matter will not collapse because you have needs. They will expand because you finally voice them. They will become bridges, not walls. And across those bridges, something deeper will walk. Trust, clarity, and love that doesn't ask you to shrink to fit it. Conclusion: peace is the practice, not the prize. Peace is not something you stumble upon after everything else is fixed. It's not a finish line you cross once all the noise fades, all the relationships align, or all the people in your life finally understand you. Peace is not the reward at the end of the chaos. It's the choice you make inside it. You may have spent years trying to earn peace by pleasing others, by keeping the peace externally, even if it cost your own. But the Buddha didn't teach us to wait for the world to calm down. He taught us to calm the mind in the midst of the world. He reminded us that freedom begins not in the future, but in this very breath. Peace is not passive. It's not sitting still while everything burns around you. It is active, conscious, daily. It's how you speak to yourself when you make a mistake. It's how you pause before saying yes when your heart says no. It's how you create space between the trigger and your reaction. It's how you choose presence over performance. You've now seen the subtle ways peace is chipped away. through manipulation disguised as need, through relationships where you're never truly heard, through criticism masked as care, through the weight of other people's chaos, through kindness that is never seen, and through the guilt of saying no. But you've also seen something else, that in every single one of those moments, you had a choice. And that choice is sacred. You don't need to wait for the perfect relationship, the apology, the understanding, or even the closure. You only need to come home to yourself. Again, and again, and again. That is the path. That is the practice. The Buddha called it right effort, not because it's always easy, but because it's always yours. So protect your peace, not with walls, but with wisdom, not by shutting others out, but by letting yourself in, not by becoming harder, but by becoming clearer. You've walked through silence, through pressure, through the quiet erosion of your peace. And in each moment, you were invited to return, not to control, not to fix, but to yourself. That return is the real journey. And this video was never just a story about others. It was always a mirror for you. A reminder that your time, your voice, your presence, they matter. And they don't need to be earned. So if your heart feels a little lighter now, if your breath is a little deeper, stay with us. There's more waiting, more teachings, more healing. And if this message touched something inside you, pass it on. Share it with someone whose heart is quietly carrying too much. They might need to hear this too. And if you want to keep walking this path together, one step, one teaching, one breath at a time, subscribe to this channel. Not just for content, but for reminders, for reconnection, for peace. Because peace is not the prize. It is the practice. And that practice begins right here.